Elbaf is moments away from being turned into a God Valley 2.0 as Shamrock is ready to play a very dangerous game. The game in question, nothing too bad, just hunting down all the giant children they can and shipping them off to Mary Joa before the Straw Hats, Scopper, and all the adult giants can step in to stop him. And with the added backup he's called in the form of two new God Knights showing up on the island, stopping him in this game may be more difficult than we think. But before we get into any of that, let's start off with the cover story, where we see Ulti tied up to a dartboard as Who's Who and his gang essentially use her as target practice. There's not really much to go on from this page except for the fact that we get official confirmation now that that was Ulti in page 1 that we saw in the last one, and based on her face and what we know about her personality, each and every one of them have a hockey-fueled headbutt coming their way in the very near future, but she will have to get down from there first and rescue her brother, because as long as Suzu has him, she's not going to make a move. At least I don't think she will. Lucky for her though, Yamato, Tama, and Speed are already waiting in the winds to crash this weird party, just a matter of how long we'll have to wait before we see them making their move. Most likely, it's going to go down in the next chapter, unless Oda really wants to put the Dino siblings through the ringer before their rescue, possibly to make them more indebted to Yamato for saving them. Either way though, it looks like the idea of Yamato gathering her own vassals while on this journey, starting with these two, is probably true, which unfortunately for all of you Yamato for Straw Hat fans, pretty much means that she's definitely not going to be joining the crew, but depending on who ends up joining her, that does bolster the Straw Hat Grand Fleet quite a bit for the final war. Speaking of wars, Scopper has Luffy and Zoro ready to start one as he easily toys around with Luffy in the beginning of this chapter. Gotta say, I knew based on the fact that he was part of the Roger Pirates' very own version of the Monster Trio, that even in his old age, Scopper would be nothing to scoff at. I mean, we've already seen how strong Rayleigh still is despite being in the 70s. Someone who just 2 years ago was able to pretty easily hold back an admiral, and whose mere presence was enough to send Blackbeard running from Amazon Lily with his tail between his legs. I mean, I know because of the situation they were in, he let Teach leave with Kobe as a hostage, and he said himself that he's not sure he'd be able to beat the Yonko at this point in his life. But I still think Rayleigh would have won that 1v1, or at the very least pushed Blackbeard into an extreme diff victory. And I'm only giving that to Blackbeard off the sheer fact that fate seems to always let him come out on top in some form or fashion. So honestly, he might still lose to Rayleigh in a fight 10 times out of 10, but he'll still find a way to get what he wants at the end. Anyway, the point is, Rayleigh, even in his advanced age, is still very strong, and since Scopper was about equal to him back in the day, is still the reason that he'd still be relatively as strong now, especially when we take in the fact that he's been in, for lack of better words, let's call it an adult relationship with a giant for the last at least 20 years. That's gotta take a lot of strength and stamina, much more than any normal human would have, which is why I was confident going into this that anything short of Luffy going Gear 5 wouldn't have really posed a threat to the old man, and I was kinda right. Though I do have to give Luffy some points in this chapter, he didn't immediately want to throw down with Scopper after being caught out both in the beginning of this chapter and at the end of the last one. Kind of impressive. I thought for sure this chapter would open up with him throwing the first punch, but instead he just says, "Hey old man, give me the key." Unfortunately, he immediately loses those same points for very easily being goaded into a fight by Scopper, essentially saying, "Hey, you chicken?" Now, I'm not sure if the way Scopper was very easily dodging Luffy's initial attacks are signs of him using Observation Haki, because it's always kind of hard to tell with that one when it's being used, so it's going to be up to the reader to choose whether or not they think he is or not in the scene. Personally, I prefer to think he's not, and he's just naturally dodging Luffy's attacks, but we do get a pretty clear use of Armament Haki as he coats the key with it and smacks Luffy into the ground. And you could tell that was a pretty serious blow, not only because it pissed off Luffy, but because it was enough to make Nami worried, and if Oda shows us one of the Straw Hats being worried about Luffy during a fight, then we know for a fact that his opponent is very dangerous. In fact, we get a second scene of one of his crewmates being worried about Luffy during this fight, when after we get this hilarious scene of Scopper shoving the key in Luffy's mouth, completely distorting his head, he ends up dropping it and pulling out his trademark axes, and beginning to draw out a flurry of air slashes that causes Zoro not only to call for Luffy to dodge, but also makes him step in to block one from hitting his captain. Now, we knew going into this that Scopper was using this fight to test Luffy. We assumed to judge if he'd be strong enough to handle Loki if he ends up going on another rampage after Luffy sets him free. But this right here, this is where we realize that Scopper is also testing out Luffy's crew, how close they are to their captain, and whether or not they'd have his back in dire situations, which Zoro jumping in to help Luffy fight the old man proved that he does. And the two are very much taking this fight seriously now, with Luffy going straight into Gear 5 and Zoro immediately pulling out all three of his swords, though he doesn't put on his bandana, so he's not ready to go completely all out just yet. Gotta say though, if Oda's plan was to have Scopper test out Luffy and his crew here in the situation, I kind of wish we would have had Sanji here instead of Zoro, just because Sanji holds the same position on Luffy's crew that Scopper did on Roger's. By the way, Scopper's last attack ended up cutting off a portion of the castle, causing it to come crashing down to the ground directly below it, which I'm betting once she ends up hearing about it is going to get him an earful from Ripley. which means it was probably a smart thing on his part that once Zoro joined the fight, he ended up surrendering before they can do any more damage to the castle, laughing the whole thing off as a joke. Though Luffy and Zoro definitely don't find the whole situation funny, in fact, they're still pretty ticked off and even end up denying Scopper's request to come find him at the end of the arc for a little chat, but that's because they still don't know who he is, due to Scopper stopping Rose from telling them. Once they find out though, I'm sure Luffy's going to be very excited and eager to talk to him again. But unfortunately, I guess this is essentially Oda's sideline Scopper for the rest of the arc, which admittedly is a bit disappointing. I thought for sure that since the kids on Elbaf were in danger, and his own son, despite being 20, is one of said kids, that he'd be at least a little involved in the main conflict, but I guess Oda has other plans for the former left hand of the Pirate King. Now that being said, I could be wrong, and I would be very, very happy to be, but his exit in this chapter really seems like Oda is telling us not to expect him to show back up until we're about to leave the island. But hey, at least Luffy finally has the key, so now he can go free Loki and possibly find out what he knows about Shanks, or, fight him. Still kind of 50-50 on which one's going to end up happening, but one thing we can almost guarantee, this is how Luffy's group is going to learn about the God Knights being on Elbaf. I don't know just yet how they're going to find out about the whole kids being hunted situation, but at least we'll finally have part of the main cast learning about the big threat for this arc. And speaking of the kids, we may have just gotten a major display of hockey when we cut to them in this chapter. Because once we head over to the school, we see 3 of them calling out a weird bird they see flying through the air. Said bird in question being Gunko's arrow bird thing that she made 2 chapters ago. But the weird thing is that when Ange looks up to the sky, she can't see anything, which leaves us with 3 possibilities. Either they were just moving so fast that by the time she looked up, they were already out of view, but that's kind of boring, so I really hope it's not that. Because the much more interesting theory is that either these 3 children are unknowingly displaying observation hockey in the scene, or that the 2 God Knights are using some form of hockey to block other hockey users from being able to see them. It's kind of a toss-up on which of these 2 are more likely because it requires either confirmation that at least these 3 kids have hockey or that Ange does, neither of which are things we can prove at this moment. But I do like the idea of the kids on Elbaf, despite wanting to move away from fighting, are naturally developing hockey and are able to tap into it without even knowing. Goes perfectly with my theory as to what Usopp's journey during this arc is going to be, but we'll have to wait a bit longer to find out what really went down here. What we don't have to wait for anymore though, is finding out who is the backup that Gunko is calling. As we see her in the chapter instantly creating another summoning circle, bringing them to Elbaf. Turns out it's not just 1, but 2 God Knights answering the call. First up is St. Summers, part of House Shepherd, an older looking gentleman who was very clearly caught off guard by the summoning as he was still in his boxers when transported to the island. And St. Kwangam, part of House Limiziv, whose names are probably completely butchered, who is surprisingly not only a Zoan Devil Fruit user, but also seemingly an awakened one. As we can see the trademark clouds around him, though these ones are white instead of black. Still not exactly sure what causes them to be one color over the other. Now the reason why Gunko summoned 2 God Knights despite Shamrock calling specifically for just 1 is because he's being called back to the Holy Land to handle some kind of urgent issue, though it's unclear by the end of this chapter if he plans on heading back right away, or if he wants to cause a little bit of chaos before he ends up leaving. Either way, now that all the key players are here, they're ready to jumpstart this mass kidnapping, starting with taking the kids over at the school, which was already evil enough, but Shamrock wants to make sure that we know that he is the complete opposite of Shanks, and decides that he wants to turn this little mission into a game. Doesn't clarify exactly what he means by that, but it's looking like we're heading straight for one of those Celestial Dragon hunting games that they hold every 3 years. And it just so happens that the last time one of these hunts were done was 3 years ago, so it's the perfect time for a new one, and based on the sinister look we see on Shamrock's face at the end of the chapter, we're going to be getting even more evidence that he is the complete opposite of Shanks in the coming chapters. But not only that, the longer he's here on the island, the more likely it's going to be revealed that he played a hand in King Hero's death, as St. Summers questions if Shamrock came to Elbaf to visit the late King's grave. Meaning that the 2 definitely had some kind of connection. The only question is, was it simply that he or the other God Knights were responsible for Hero's death, or was there a much more evil side to the late King that we have yet to discover?